Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for up to 6 minutes, Senator Tillis for up to 10 minutes, and Senator Sanders for up to 20 minutes prior to the scheduled roll call vote.
Is there an objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Senator McConnell for his constancy over the last 3 years. We've been out on the floor together many times to speak about the need to support Ukraine. The last time, and I also want to thank my colleague Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire, the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, for organizing this bipartisan gathering. Senator Tillis from North Carolina is here as well. It's nice to be here in a bipartisan way with people from both sides of the aisle to work on something of this critical importance to my state of Colorado, to the country, and to the world. Senator McConnell, not surprisingly today, talked about that very, very famous lesson that Ronald Reagan taught all of us, Mr. President, and that was his pursuit of strength, of peace through strength. And I was on the floor talking about that last week. Today we have a corollary to that, to Ronald Reagan's rule, peace through strength, from Senator McConnell, which is don't mistake surrender for peace. Don't mistake surrender for peace. And the lesson that Ronald Reagan was teaching when he said peace through strength was a lesson that history had taught him. And history had taught the free world. Dust off your reliable 10th grade Western civics textbook and look up President Woodrow Wilson's attempts to achieve, quote, peace without victory for either side. That's how he described it, as an example of the failure that weakness invites, the kind of weakness that Leader McConnell was talking about. Before the United States even had entered World War I, President Wilson tried to force both sides to accept a peace deal they didn't want by depriving them of weapons and depriving them of funds. In 1916, again, before the United States was directly aiding the Allies, financiers from the United States were financing the UK, which was at war, and also funding their allies in mainland Europe. So Wilson's government cautioned U.S. investors against issuing short-term bonds to the UK and to France. This presidential expression of disapproval had the effect of cutting off U.S. private assistance to Europe altogether. And the record is painfully clear. President Wilson's decision created a financial crisis in the United Kingdom, but it did nothing to end the war. Instead, Germany in 1917 only escalated their attacks on civilian shipping from the United States, prompting Congress finally to declare war and approve a $3 billion loan to France and to England. By the way, just to amplify what the leader has already said this morning, that $3 billion loan was about $81 billion in today's dollars. When you think about the roughly $120 billion that we have invested in Ukraine. And in 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, even more famously than Wilson, tried to appease Hitler with the infamous Munich Agreement, through which the UK and France and Italy allowed Nazi Germany to annex part of peaceful Czechoslovakia. As our history textbooks show, Hitler never stopped in Czechoslovakia, but continued his war throughout Europe. Just as Wilson and Chamberlain failed, friends of freedom in Ukraine and around the world should not pressure Ukraine into accepting an unjust peace that will never, ever last. Only with security guarantees from Europe and the United States can we have some assurance that Putin will not invade Ukraine again, and at a moment when he thinks the world is not watching. That's a guarantee. That is a guarantee. I visited Ukraine last month with my friends Senator Shaheen and Senator Tillis, who are both here today. We saw the courage of the Ukrainian people up close. We've seen the courage they have forged to save their country and the suffering they have endured. 43,000 deaths and another almost 400,000 casualties. Not just on behalf of Ukraine, Mr. President, but on behalf of Europe, the West, democracy, freedom, our national security. In cemeteries all across Ukraine, fresh graves are piled high with dirt and flowers, testifying to the Ukrainian people's sacrifice. To put it in American terms, Colorado terms, there is not a county in the entire country where somebody hasn't lost somebody to this war. But the Ukrainian people have not had to fight this fight alone. The American people have steadfastly and generously backed this fight to the tune of, as I mentioned, $125 billion. I won't go through all the reasons why that's been good for the United States, as Senator McConnell said, and that's a lot of money, but it's just about 0.53% of our GDP. That's about $365 in America. Our European allies and far-flung ones like Australia and Japan have stepped up as well because they know that supporting Ukraine means standing with people willing to do anything to fight for their country. They know that with American weapons and those of our allies, the American people have literally kept Putin's army at the gates of Europe while forcing him to squander more than $200 billion and stagger casualties of 700,000 people. We learned while we were in Ukraine that the Ukrainians are killing more Russians today than they were 6 months ago. We all want this war to end, which is why I was glad to see the U.S. commit today to resuming intelligence sharing and security assistance to Ukraine as part of the potential U.S.-brokered 30-day ceasefire with Russia. But for the sake of Ukraine and the rest of the free world, we must not pressure Ukraine to silence their guns unless Russia commits to do the same. We cannot force Ukraine to accept an end of this war that is anything other than a just and enduring peace. This requires that the United States, our allies in Ukraine, continue working together to establish terms of the peace and negotiate with Putin, while the Ukrainians continue their brave fight. They're not asking to be relieved of this terrible burden. I couldn't even imagine the other day when we were in Kyiv how cold it must have felt to people who were on the front lines of that war. It was cold enough just in the streets of Kyiv. It was cold enough just getting on the train from Poland to go to Kyiv. But they're embracing their responsibility because they know that any ceasefire without credible security guarantees will allow Putin to rebuild his army and attack again. And they know that how this war ends will determine whether Putin sets his sights on our NATO allies like Poland and the Baltics. To conclude that anything other result is possible is to completely ignore history. It's to completely ignore what Putin is saying. And whether dictators like China's Xi Jinping test our resolve by invading Taiwan, whether the post-World War II international order the U.S. and our allies created persists, and whether the United States continues to provide the leadership our parents and grandparents supplied since the end of that war. That is what Senator McConnell calls on us to remember. Throughout history, it's been too easy for some to ignore the moral responsibility we have to people who are sacrificing their lives a continent away on behalf of our shared values and interests. It is harder in these moments, but important and I would say necessary for the living to stand for freedom and democracy, and those willing to give their last breaths to make those values eternal. We in this chamber have to demand the moral and strategic clarity by continuing to support Ukraine's fight to secure a truly just peace through strength. Because as the Ukrainian-born author Vasily Grossman wrote nearly 70 years ago, in the cruel and terrible time in which our generation has been condemned to live on this earth, we must never make peace with evil. We must never become indifferent to others or undemanding of ourselves. With that, Mr. President, I thank my bipartisan colleagues again. I look forward to the day when we're out here not with 8 senators, but 80 senators in support of freedom and in support of the fight that Ukraine is leading. I yield the floor.